In ancient Rome, slaves were treated as property and had the official status of talking implements. Under Roman law, the punishment for injuring or killing another slave was equal to that for damaging a domestic animal. Inhuman treatment of one's own slaves, at least in the classical period of Rome, was not punished. Later in our era, however, some merciful emperors passed laws restricting the arbitrary behavior of slave owners. However, the differences in the status of different categories of slaves were considerable. The Romans, who were strictly detail-oriented, categorized slaves into many separate groups. One of the most significant was the division into private and public slaves. Public slaves were usually called city slaves and belonged to the municipality of the city. They did the most unpleasant jobs, such as cleaning the sewers. There were also state slaves who worked in quarries, mines, and other heavy labor. However, even among the state slaves there were privileged classes. For example, slaves could be petty officials and scribes, prison and temple officials, messengers and servants of low-ranking officials who could not afford their own servants according to their status. The labor of slaves engaged in agriculture was incredibly hard. They fed on offal and worked in the fields and farms from dawn until late at night. They were constantly supervised by overseers, often slaves, but who had the power and duty to force others to work hard for their master. If a slave was suspected of having a tendency to run away, he might be put in chains. Some slaves were sent to spin a millstone, tied to a lever with a neck and arm restraint to prevent them from stealing a handful of flour. Accommodation for agricultural slaves was called ergastulas, usually semi-subterranean cells without any facilities or simply covered pits. Usually even a strong male slave working on a large feudal estate lived there for about 7 years. City slaves, especially those owned by masters in workshops or small merchants, fared much better. These slaves were more likely to do auxiliary work, to be laborers' assistants, small managers, or shopkeepers. Outwardly, they could be distinguished from free Romans only by the presence of a round earring in one ear, which was a symbolic sign of slavery. Domestic slaves also lived well, and there were many of them. Only to serve the patrician at the table required: a slave who set the table, another slave who placed the food, taster who checked the food for poison, a slave who poured wine into bowls, a young slave with thick hair, which the master wiped his hands after a hearty meal. And that's not to mention slave dancers, slave musicians, jesters, and jugglers. It was prestigious not to use the services of hired personnel, but to have a full staff of slaves ready to come to the rescue in any situation. City slaves, especially those owned by masters in workshops or small merchants, fared much better. These slaves more often performed auxiliary work, were assistants to laborers, small managers or salesmen, etc. Outwardly, they could be distinguished from free Romans only by the presence of a round earring in one ear, which was a symbolic sign of slavery. Domestic slaves also lived well, and there were many of them. Only to serve the patrician at the table required: a slave who set the table, another slave who placed the food, taster who checked the food for poison, a slave who poured wine into bowls, a young slave with thick hair, which the master wiped his hands after a hearty meal. And that's not to mention slave dancers, slave musicians, jesters, and jugglers. A lucky slave could eventually buy his freedom from his master and become a free man, and there were many such cases in Rome. However, not all slaves were lucky. The master had every right to kill or mutilate a slave at will. A slave could be sold to a brothel. A slave could be sent to the gladiator arena or the quarries, or simply sold at the slave market if the master needed urgent money. For any violation, slaves were punished and sometimes killed with extreme cruelty. The Romans were not mistaken about the love of slaves for their masters. A Roman proverb stated, "As many slaves, so many enemies." If a master was murdered, all the slaves in his house were executed without discerning each slave's individual guilt. A slave had the right to marry with his master's permission, but his wife and children could be sold at any time without his consent. The life of an indentured individual in ancient Rome was an extremely harsh existence for most such people. It was a particularly humiliating condition for prisoners of war. Not so long ago, they had been proud warriors, fathers of families, or free citizens. But now they had to perform the most grueling and indecent labor, obeying the whims of their masters without question. No wonder the slaves tried to escape from time to time. And not only private slaves, but also city-owned slaves and state slaves. How did the Romans try to find them after they escaped? Since slaves in ancient Rome were treated as possessions, the methods of finding them were not very different from the methods of finding other missing valuables. First and foremost, the loss of a slave had to be avoided. Slaves were watched. In the case of domestic slaves, this was not only by their own masters, but also by other slaves. A slave who prevented a runaway, by reporting another runaway to his master in time, was rewarded and given privileges. And those who did not report the escape, or even helped in it, were threatened with punishments, including the most cruel ones. In places where slaves were held en masse, mines, large estates, there was a coherent system of slave control. Nowadays, collars with information about the owner are used for pets that may get lost. The ancient Romans also developed a similar simple measure. Slaves were required to wear iron collars with a plate engraved with their owner's name. This rule was not always enforced, and the collars of domestic slaves may have been rather symbolic. However, on latifundia, slaves did wear such collars. The return of such a slave to his owner was rewarded, sometimes exceeding the market value of the slave himself. It was important for the slave owner to let the other slaves know that an escape attempt was futile, as any free Roman would immediately recognize them and return them back to their master. It was also required that slaves be clearly visible to prevent escape. Their clothing was extremely simple. Sometimes slaves sewed them themselves from old rags and scraps left by their masters. Sometimes they were bought almost the same patchwork clothes made of cheap rags. In any case, slaves were forbidden to wear certain types of clothing that were reserved for free Romans, such as togas or felt hats worn by freedmen. Such hats were called pileus or pylos, and were sometimes worn even by full Roman citizens. The identity of a slave woman was even simpler. They were not allowed to wear jewelry, and unlike free women in Rome, they went out uncovered. A free Roman woman was obliged to wear at least a headband. Roman women wore dresses called stola, while slave women wore simple tunics. In addition, slave women were not allowed to have elaborate hairstyles. In general, a slave girl could be immediately distinguished from a free Roman woman at a glance. If a slave escaped, the master was obliged to inform the authorities. At the same time, all known signs of a fugitive were transmitted. Any suspicious persons who were caught were checked against lists of such signs, and in case of coincidence, were sent to the owner to find out where they lived. Although Rome was a huge city, from the very beginning of its founding, people lived in neighborhoods called tribe, which means tribe. Neighbors knew each other, and many were related by kinship. Any stranger on the street was noticed at once. Of course, late Rome was more cosmopolitan, but it was still much harder to get lost in it, as in any other city in the Roman Empire, than in modern cities. It was also extremely difficult for a slave to go unnoticed because of the very structure of Roman society. It was impossible to get far on foot, as any random Roman on the road could spot a fugitive and report it. Leaving by sea was even more difficult. Money was required, and a ship's captain would not take a stranger on board. After all, he could be a bandit or an agent of pirates, just hiding in the surrounding forests or joining a band of brigands. But such people were hunted down by special squads of city guards. In addition, a lone wanderer had to be wary of slave herders, who would turn fugitives over to their masters for a fee. Because of all these reasons, a slave had to make great efforts to escape outside Rome.